Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Gemma Vaness. The United States plans to send up to 6 nuclear-capable bombers to northern Australia. The US Air Force has drawn up detailed plans to build dedicated facilities for the B-52s at Tyndall Air Base, south of Katherine. The squadrons will be able to run operations and training missions out of the Northern Territory during the dry season. The US Ambassador to Australia, Carolyn Kennedy, says America will continue to work with allies to combat the rising influence of China in the region.
Certainly, the region has faced increasing tensions. I know that since I served in Japan. But America has, for the past 75 years, worked really hard to support the rules-based order that's lifted millions of people out of poverty and really has supported peace and stability throughout this region, and that commitment hasn't changed. So I think we do it through diplomacy, we do it through dialogue, we do it through deterrence.
To discuss this further, we're joined by Marcus Hellyer, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, whose work focuses on defence economics and military capability. Marcus Hellyer, can you spell out for us exactly what is changing at the Tyndall Air Base and when this is happening?
Well, in some senses, there's not too much new here. So your viewers may be familiar with the US Force Posture Initiative, under which US Marines have been rotating through Darwin for essentially a decade now. There's a second strand to that activity called the Enhanced Air Cooperation, under which US aircraft have been rotating through Northern Australia for 5 years now. And so there's nothing new that US bombers such as the B-52 or the much more modern B-2 have been coming to Australia. And in fact, for a month, 3 B-2 bombers were operating out of Northern Australia earlier this year. And in fact, they're a much more potent and dangerous capability than the B-52, which is an aircraft that's essentially 60 years old now. But what the new bit seems to be that the US is building facilities in Northern Australia at Tyndall Air Base, which will help support those operations on a sort of more enduring kind of basis. So rather than it being a sort of temporary fly in, fly out kind of activity, they could potentially stay for a bit longer, having the necessary support infrastructure here.
So how provocative a move is that?
Well, I mean, every time Australia buys new boots for the army, the Chinese Communist Party regards that as a provocation. So, you know, the CCP is going to say what it's going to say. What this really is a ramping up of allied deterrence in the Indo-Pacific to try and deter China from starting a conflict over Taiwan. So, you know, we call it deterrence. They'll regard it as a provocation. But what we're trying to do, the US and its allies such as Australia, is to create a deterrent that can convince the CCP that it can't win a war over Taiwan and therefore won't start one.
The Guam US military base is close by, relatively speaking. So would the expanded nature of the airbase in the Northern Territory be supporting of that, or are they pulling back from the Guam base?
Well, the US certainly isn't pulling back from Guam. In fact, by doing this, it's signalling to its allies and partners in the Western Pacific that it's here to stay. But the challenge that the US has to deal with is that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, so the armed forces of China, now have missiles that can reach US bases such as Guam. And so the US doesn't have a lot of airfields and bases to operate in the Western Pacific. And so it's really quite concentrated in those locations, which makes it very vulnerable to long-range Chinese missiles. So early in any conflict over Taiwan, the PLA will be aiming a lot of missiles at US airfields in places like Guam or in mainland Japan or in Okinawa. So the US strategy is to essentially disperse. So it's trying to find more places that it can operate out of. So it makes it harder for the PLA to target those bases. And essentially, it has fallback options. So if Guam is hit hard, it can transfer some of its operations to other places. So it's certainly not abandoning Guam, and it's not abandoning its allies. In a sense, this is all about reinforcing resolve and showing that the US is finding other ways to help its allies.
So here in Australia, is this the start of a greater expansion?
Well, I think, the US would like to have a greater presence in Australia for the reasons I just spoke about. It was very clear that the previous government was supportive of that. And what we've seen so far out of the Albanese government is that they're quite supportive as well. And so those kinds of measures of enabling US forces to operate out of Northern Australia, I would imagine are going to continue.
And does that put a target on us, and specifically the top end?
Well, unfortunately, I think we are already a target for a number of reasons as a strong ally of the United States. It's no secret that Pine Gap is a very important facility for the US and its allies. So that was probably already a target should, a conflict escalate to a nuclear conflict. So it's no secret that if there is a major war between the US and China, it's not just going to sort of be focused on the Taiwan Strait, that there are lots of possibilities for it to escalate. And so we can escalate horizontally, to use a technical term, meaning that other geographic locations could be the site of conflict. So you've really got two options if you're a country like Australia. You can essentially bury your head in the sand and hope to somehow be neutral and hope the rest of the world will simply leave you alone. Or you can actually support your allies to enhance deterrence, to increase the deterrent effect on a country like China, and prevent a war from happening that way. And Australian governments have chosen the latter path.
Marcus Hellyer, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Anytime. Thank you.